Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. For this episode, I'm thrilled to be joined by two of the most influential figures in learning and memory science, Dr. Robert and Elizabeth Bjork. Their pioneering research on topics such as desirable difficulties, retrieval practice, metacognition, and goal-directed forgetting have transformed our understanding of how people actually learn versus how we believe they learn. In this episode, we'll focus on the actionable insights for adult learning and professional development, with the goal of providing you with the best practices in learning science to update your learning operating system. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. You both have made such an impactful contribution to the science of learning. Could you share a bit, each of you, about your academic journey and what initially drew you to the study of human memory and learning?
Well, if you want me to start, I will. Although my history with respect to this question is a little bit embarrassing, in that the way I first got exposed to psychology at all was on the advice of some fellow students. It was my senior year. I had two hard math courses to complete yet, and also a GE course, or general education course. And so I knew that I would be very, very busy with homework and so forth in the math courses. And so I asked my friends, I need a GE course that I know I can cram for and pass the test. And so they told me, well, have you had intro psych yet? Which is a very favorite course among many undergraduates. I said, no. And they said, oh, you should take that. They teach it to 1,000 students at once. So they don't give that many quizzes, and they're always multiple choice. And so you'll be able to keep up by cramming and do okay on the test. So that's how my first introduction, that's how I got into this psych course. I'd always avoided them in the past because everything I knew about psychology was Freud. And I thought, that's not me. I don't want that. I want to stick with some place where I can use my mathematics training. And so I discovered in psychology, there was this field in my psychology course, that there was this field called mathematical psychology. And so I got intrigued with that, and I learned a little bit more about it by asking people who were in that field. And so when I graduated, in addition to applying, knew I wanted to go to grad school. I wanted to remain involved in research, and also I like the idea of teaching at the college level. And so I applied to a number of graduate schools in math and also in psychology. And there weren't that many universities at the time that had courses in math psych, but University of Michigan in Ann Arbor was one of them. So I applied there and I got accepted, and they also gave me a fellowship. So now the math department, which I also applied to there at Michigan, also accepted me. But when I went to visit them, I told them about this dilemma. I wasn't sure which way I wanted to go. And they said, well, accept the psychology one because they're offering you a fellowship. The only thing this time is a TA-ship. And then if you change your mind, you can take our grad courses and see what you think, as well as theirs. And that they had a very cooperative relationship between the math department and the psych department there. And then after a year, you probably will be more convinced which way you want to go. So that was how I got into math psych, which since now I tell students all the time that don't cram your way through college, because you won't remember any of the wonderful things you learned as an undergraduate if you crammed for all your courses. And that was how cramming, the need to have a course for which I crammed for was what led me into psychology. It's kind of embarrassing part of this.
I was at University of Minnesota and had been 1 year at a St. Olaf College where I was a chemistry major, and then I couldn't afford to remain there. I went to the university, changed into physics. In my senior year, I had this big crisis, which was I saw what everyday physics involved, and it wasn't the kind of simple things historically that I was so interested in, but now big team projects, special equipment. So I went to see an advisor, and I too had just taken an intro psych, and I said, "Well, that's interesting because that's a new field. Physics is so developed. That's a new field." And so she told me that I should go talk to a particular person in the psychology department, David LaBerge, who was very animated. He'd won the university's teaching award, and he was telling me all about this field, bouncing around in his office, drawing things on the blackboard and that I didn't understand. And I thought, boy, this is terrific. And so I decided to go into mathematical psychology. Remained there 1 year. Then in the middle of that year, that same advisor said that he had just heard that this major figure in mathematical psychology, William Estes, who later went on the National Medal of Science, had moved to Stanford, and Stanford was where I really should be. I wanted, like, why does he want to get rid of me? But then it turned out, I said, well, if you say so. So I went on to Stanford, and that was a wonderful time in grad school, a lot of excitement over mathematical models of learning memory phenomena, and really was just some kind of great good fortune on my part.
Can you explain this concept and why making things hard on yourself in the right way is actually very valuable?
Yeah, this is something that is it's as much of a challenge as it is also super important, which is it's not in our kind of nature to think that we're going to make things harder on ourselves to enhance learning. That is, we tend to think of that we have some style or procedure of learning and that's what we should adhere to. But it becomes crucial, actually, to realize the relationship between learning and forgetting. I mean, it's very simple and natural to think learning is building up something in my memory system. Forgetting is losing some of what I built up. And as intuitive that is, it's not only not completely true, it's almost completely wrong, which is the very things that cause forgetting, a change of context, or the primary example is just simply spacing. That is, if I learn something and now when I'm tested later, the longer that delay, the worse I tend to do. That's the forgetting function. But actually, when I look at where a relearning opportunity is optimal, then it's at a longer interval. That is, the worst thing you can do is the kind of mass practice that we all tended to get in one time or another if we were in college courses where we get behind in some subject and now we're worried about the midterm or final exam and we maybe even stay up all night. That can rescue your exam score. And I must say, both Elizabeth and I certainly did that. But if your interest is in if this material is important and it's going to underlie subsequent learning, it is about the worst thing you can do because mass practice is accompanied by a dramatic forgetting function. That is, it's measured and you can be a couple days later after the exam you had that you remember very little of the material.
And that's great to know because many people feel that if it's hard, if it's difficult at first, it's not very valuable and they're not going to pursue it because they're not making enough progress soon enough. And I remember back in school with cramming too, and there's a lot of research and you can validate this that backs it up that cramming's great if you want to do well on the test the next day. Where
Right.
it really falters is if you want, like what you just said, Robert, that long-term retention over a period of
Yeah.
time, which most adults are looking for. They don't have a test in the next day or the next few days that they can then quickly forget the information. They want this information to stick so they can use it and apply it and
Yep.
become better. Right?
That's right.
Cramming is students' favorite way of studying because they've had these experiences where you stay up all night cramming and at 17, 18, 19, 20, you're able to do that without much problem. And then you're able to take the test and succeed. After that, maybe a week, a few days, a week, you probably can't remember almost any of this stuff that you knew when you walked in to take that exam. And I think because while you're reading the same thing over and over again, you get this feeling, yeah, I'm getting this. I'm getting this. I understand this. Yes. So there's this kind of ongoing feeling that you're learning. Whereas in fact, all you're doing is probably some sort of low level recognition of, I just read that. I remember reading this and so forth, which is not going to sustain you later when a week or so later when you're asked about that information that you had at your fingertips at one point, but now it's gone.
And you have that illusion of mastery because it's familiarity, not recall that you're building. When I talked to Dr. Daniel Willingham out of Virginia, he had stated the same thing, that people that reread their notes, that highlight, it gives you that sense of familiarity, which is one of the roadblocks to true learning, because you feel like you're learning something and you're overconfident with it, when in actuality, you don't really have that storage strength. What do you think is the most crucial pitfalls for adults in this regard?
You need to learn that you can't trust your memory. As long as you're like following somebody, like somebody in front of you is doing the motions and so forth, and you're just following them, and you get this feeling like I'm learning. This is great. Now I know how to make whatever. I know how to do this kind of a step in dancing or so forth. But now when you're left alone and you don't have that person there that you can just mimic, sometimes you don't even remember, how do I even start? Do I start with my right foot, my left foot, whatever? We need to learn that what seems easy is probably all because based on this, coming from this familiarity. It just seems familiar, therefore it's easy, therefore I know it. But the only real way to just make sure you know it, and we get this question from students all the time, how do I tell when I'm reading that I'm really learning, is to try to recall it later, what you read. And so give yourself, one of the desirable difficulties is retrieval practice. And so give yourself a lot of tests as you're going. Maybe go read something else, do something else, come back, and now try to answer these questions. Or even just write out, what did I just read? What were the main points, etc. And you'll realize that maybe you can get one or two of them when there were really 5 or 6 that you should have learned and you felt like you were learning at the time. And so now you can go back and study again. But that sort of constant thing of testing yourself, do I really have this? You have to wait for a while and try to retrieve it on your own, not just read it again, like you're saying, and it's seeming, you get this feeling of familiar. Oh, I remember seeing this. I remember reading this. And so that's not going to support you when you're on and you have to do this.
And I think it can be important to emphasize just how broad these principles are. I mean, over the years, I've been invited to talk to probably 20, 25 occasions to go to a football training camp, soccer principals, very often to talk to PGA professionals and so on. Now, I'm not telling them how to swing the golf club or in these other sports, but as skilled as they often are not optimizing their schedule and their practice. One thing you'll see, in fact, I mentioned this to some reporter, that people do all the wrong things in golf when they're at the driving range. They hit the same club over and over again. They line themselves up with the mat, and they kind of think this repetition will just imprint itself. And so this reporter arranged to come with a filming crew, and we went to a driving range near the Los Angeles airport. And we didn't have any stooges or anything. We just filmed different people. And, and you play golf, you'll hit one shot. The next one won't be with that club. And now maybe one foot is higher than the other. And anyway, these are very broad principles. And, we were asked, Elizabeth and I were asked to, was it Cleveland Indians that had us come to their training camp? That was an amazing experience being there, because just how motivated they are and so on. But I'll just give one quick example of what we saw, because it's kind of interesting. They have this state-of-the-art equipment there in every possible way. And these machines, batting machines, will do anything you want. They'll throw a curveball, they'll throw a soft, they'll do whatever. And we were there and we found out that they were setting these machines, the players, to show perfect strikes right down the middle. They said, well, they just wanted to work on their swing and not be kind of making judgments about the ball. But there was just surprisingly misguided. And all of these were very talented. They were brought there because of their potential. But
Sometimes when we stopped and asked them, well, now what's it going to be like when you're actually in a game? Are you going to know what the pitcher is kind of? Are you going to know that the pitcher's going to throw you a curveball or a fastball or the various things that pitchers do before? And so you should make your practice be more like that. They somehow bought into that, but whether after we left they were going to practice that way or not, I don't know. Another time we talked to some of the coaches, football coaches there at UCLA, and I remember the defensive coordinator in particular, and sort of these light bulbs went off as we were talking. He said, "So the way I do my practicing right now is I have these dummies set up, and I have the tackle or tackle this dummy this way, and they do it several times, and then you move to the next dummy, and you do a different kind of tackle on that dummy for several times in a row. And so you're telling me I should have them tackle this dummy in the way I want, and then move on and tackle the next dummy in this different way and so forth, and then come back and mix this all up?" And we said, "Yeah." And now I don't know if he ever tried it, and we didn't hear back from him. His defensive team was better than it had been. But it's like it just doesn't occur to people to introduce these kind of retrievals that now I have to retrieve. What's my procedure when I have to make this kind of a tackle? All right, do it. Now, procedure for doing this kind of tackle, but not just doing it over the same thing over and over and over again.
And the variation can actually make it more interesting as well. We worked quite a bit with a soccer coach in England who headed up programs for youth training in soccer. These are kids who have been judged to be very promising in their abilities in soccer. And he too was saying, well, you mean rather than having a line of the kids up to try penalty kicks over and over again in the same spot, we should mix up the spots. We should interleave throwing the ball in, all of those things. And he had such success with that other coaches who were in that same kind of league helping to work with kids started adopting those kind of practices. So
Wow.
I guess we're just maybe overemphasizing the generality of this, because sometimes you think, well, what I'm really concerned about is this other sort of learning activity.
That's a good point, because you're right. This gets to that point of interleaving, which is one of the critical learning principles that in math, you don't work the same math problem and then work a different problem. You mix it up. That desirable difficulties helps to embed it in a deeper way in your brain. And like what you were saying, whether it's sports, whether it's cognitive work, it helps. That part of it is just really essential to build stronger learning pathways, neural pathways for that. It may not feel that way initially, but in time, it's so much more effective. And like what you said, Elizabeth, and I've heard this a lot from different major league franchises, they don't want their best hitters going to the home run derby because you get the same pitch every time to hit it out of the park. That's not how they're going to see it in a game. And
Right.
getting to more a foundational level, I think a lot of leaders need to hear this, is that this learning science, like you said, Robert, is so foundational to everything, whether it's motor skills, sports, whether it's cognitive work. I like to say learning how to learn is a meta skill that allows you to master everything else faster. Talk
Right.
to me a little bit about that new theory of disuse, because I love the storage strength versus retrieval strength and some of the counterintuitive elements of this model.
The somewhat awkward title of the new theory of disuse, we kind of wondered whether that was the best choice or not. But there was a sort of law of disuse many decades ago that got kind of that things fade without continued, that like learning kind of decays like footprints in the sand or something over time. And so the new theory of disuse, we kind of went point by point over what was wrong about those old ideas, what needed to be added. And so one basic thing is, once something's learned, and this could be as simple as names of your friends from your high school or whatever, you may have a sense many years later that that's all decayed and gone away and none. But actually, if you reinstate certain contexts, in fact, an example a lot of people experienced where there's a class reunion or something, now you're back in maybe the town or school or whatever where there's a lot of cues. And now, even though these friends of yours don't sort of look the same now, 30 years later, but that will reinstate enough context that names can come back to you in a sort of dramatic way.
So the retrieval strength versus storage strength is really how well it's learned and integrated something is into your memory. The retrieval strength is how accessible it is at the moment.
Right.
And even forgotten skills that usually they still reside in your memory. You've just lost the retrieval part of that. That, like you said, if given the same context or some cues, you can retrieve those because they're not completely lost, because it's all about retrieval strength for a lot of leaders wanting to retrieve
Yes.
this information. How do we make that easier for them?
I don't know about if this makes it easier for them, but I think one thing that people really have a big fear of failure. And it's unpleasant to fail at something, sure. But so they tend to think, I want to avoid failing. So that's one reason they'll, do the same thing over and over again. And we have to teach people that failing shouldn't be looked at as something bad. Making a mistake is an opportunity, or a failure to retrieve something is an opportunity to enhance your learning, because now you realize, well, I don't know how to go from what should be step 2 to step 3. So I go back and now I try to learn that again. So, and I think that's what makes cramming so beloved by students, that in addition to the fact that you can cram and do well on a subsequent immediate test, they don't like that feeling of failure. And we need to help people realize you shouldn't look at forgetting as a failure. It's an opportunity to learn something better. It tells you, okay, you don't know this as well as you thought you did. So you need to try to increase your storage strength for that item.
And
That's
the
another thing.
relationship of storage strength and retrieval strength is, on the one hand, people can understand one dynamic, namely that the more something's learned, or in this language would be storage strength, the slower it'll be forgotten. That is, the slower you lose retrieval strength. But other aspects of it are completely unintuitive, which is, for example, that as far as gaining storage strength, current retrieval strength can almost get in the way. That is, the higher and more available it is, it becomes almost impossible to add storage strength. So you need forgetting in the form of a loss of retrieval strength to gain more storage strength. And that forgetting can be caused by spacing, which was the prominent example we talked about, by changing the environmental context, by doing other cues like varying who else you might work with in some team. So that framework has just proved to be very applicable to children's learning. We've emphasized a bit about sports here today, about how to manage studying. But again, it can be, to be your maximally effective teacher, you need to do some things that are going to seem unintuitive and unfortunately can be quite unappreciated. If your main goal is to optimize the student ratings of your teaching, you will tend to do some non-optimal things in terms of managing the class.
Yeah.
Well, and you brought up something that I think is really counterintuitive too, that I've learned from your model as well, is that people have this overconfidence in their learning if they can retrieve it easily because of cramming. But it
Yes.
doesn't mean that they have strong storage strength, that they've really learned this material. It's just that they can retrieve it easy right now because they've just reviewed it and crammed for that. With many people, I think that gets in the way, thinking, well, I've learned it. If I can retrieve it, it's in my memory, I'm good to move on and I can learn something else. But that's not necessarily the case, especially not when it comes to cramming and learning it in a very short period of time under a mass practice type of learning session.
It also becomes very broadly relevant in terms of people make judgments about whether some domain is something where they've got the skills or instincts or whatever. And it can take some early difficulties, maybe in the first math course they had, they struggled some. Well, math's not my thing. If it was my thing, this would be easy for me. Then they make all subsequent decisions, choices they make about what courses take, what fields get into. They can make these things be a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's not that they couldn't have achieved in a given domain, but they make decisions and choices that ensure they won't gain appreciable expertise.
One simple thing that students can do, and they seem very they seem very accepting to this idea, is just changing your context. So let's say a standard advice to students is you want to find some place where to study and then do all your studying in that place. So you're going to go to the library, you sit at the same table, same whatever, and you do all your studying there. It's actually better if you force yourself to keep changing the context in which you're studying. That is an easy way to introduce some variability into your learning. So, and it seems like it works well even for just moving from, like studying maybe in a coffee shop, studying in the library, studying under a tree and quad or something like that. Just simple things for students to do. And they seem very, very willing to do that. They'll have an improvement to their ability to retrieve this information in any context. Like now they're in a room on campus they've never been in before and have to take an exam.
It tickles me to think of some of the early work we did. Some of this was the University of Michigan, for example, and where Stephen Smith was an undergrad working with us. He went on to prominence at the Texas A&M University. But anyway, when we were thinking about the variation, we just did experimental work where people would come back to the same place and study or go to a different place. But we really made it different. So this was on the Michigan campus. And one room that they could study in was a seminar room, looked out over the quad. Another room they could work in was in a basement of the psychology building where research with animals tended to be done. And it was no views out the windows. It had some cages that had been used for experiments with rats. And that early work led to a lot of other work that just showed that substantially better recall of something that's studied or practiced in two different environments rather than the same one.
Well, that really speaks to transfer of learning. And we see that a lot with professional training as well, that they say it doesn't transfer beyond the training session, but love how you state that varying the learning context supports memories, the where, the when, the how we practice, improves the durability and the flexibility. And from your research and others, repeating material in different environments with different tools alongside different types of tasks prevents our brains from tying knowledge to a single set of cues, which I think is so essential to understand. And instead, retrieved memories become less context dependent and more accessible across varied circumstances. So if you want transfer to improve, change up the spaces, the places, and the faces. Make sure that you vary the learning environments, even though there's some research that states to help with having a steady habit, study in a certain place at a certain time of day builds that habit quicker. But if you want the learning to stick, you got to change up the environmental cues as well.
It may get you to study that you've got this one place that you associate with studying, and maybe it's got quite other features. So if your problem is to get yourself to study at all, maybe there's something to be said for using that. But if you want what you've studied to be recallable later to transfer that, it's not effective.
Well, let's talk more about forgetting. Ebbinghaus forgetting curve we use a lot throughout learning science. It's an exponential decay function where the first few days is really critical because if you don't apply it, retrieve it, find ways to make it more indelible in your brain, it just seems to disappear fairly quickly. And that really speaks to the spacing effect. Hermann Ebbinghaus, late 1800s, did a lot of work on this to start it out with nonsense syllables where he could remember certain things. And he proved, and there was this one study, I think it was in 1886, he proved that if he spaced out the learning over time and still had the refresher of 7 study sessions before he was tested on it, he could nearly cut in half the amount of study time.
Yeah.
If you spaced it out instead of trying to mass practice it in one study session. Talk to us a little bit more about that spacing effect and if there's an optimal space before you retrieve it, because you want to hit it just before you forget it to make it difficult. But are there any parameters or best practices that you can help professionals with regarding that retrieval and spacing?
I think we've found we can state the general principles with some confidence. But then when people have approached us and say, here's my particular situation and I've got to do this in my job, or I want to do this and that's in my law school, then it's like we're missing information that we would need to know to make a confident recommendation. That is, we don't know what the rate of forgetting this material is. Some things forgotten more rapidly and should be restudied sooner, others more slowly later. And so it's easy enough to state the general principles, but often how they're to be applied. And I think here's again something where we've had a lot of teachers approach us over the years, especially online. And these have varied, these contexts, amazing kind of array of people who are teaching in foreign countries, or like one amazing teacher in a part of Mississippi, which had the lowest scores for high school students, was teaching, what was it, Elizabeth? It was,
Some sort of math course.
yeah, sort of like advanced algebra or something. But he got those kids to levels that actually they got their college board scores on those exams got questioned, because how could those kids from that school score at that level? But he was just so good at implementing the kind of activities that would exercise these processes and the timing. Another, we won't go into details, another teacher in England who just changed the primary school. I guess it was more like junior level, wasn't it? But he went out and actually get an award from Parliament for what he did. But seemed so unintuitive and so different in terms of the demands it put on students.
Oh, that's great insight there. And you're right. We do know that there's an exponential decay function with forgetting. So it happens a lot right away. If you can stabilize that period, reinforce it somehow, it smooths out over time. So you tend to keep what you have if you've reinforced it enough in that interim short period of time, whether it's a few weeks, a few months, or a few years. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.